just say a few words at the beginning to contextualize our panel, and I thought it might be helpful to contextualize it historically in relation to what's happened with the application of Buddhist knowledge and beneficial power to the human needs within societies prior to its coming to the West, and what that may mean for how it's coming to the West. It strikes me that as Buddhism made new roots into new cultures throughout Asia and spread through Asia, which was gradual development, and as people learned in the new cultures to study and to practice Buddhism in a very, very deep way, inevitably, because at the core of Buddhist values is the compassionate expression of what has been engaged, Buddhist learnings and practices have taken expression in a tremendous number of very specific, concrete ways of meeting deep felt human needs within diverse Asian cultures. And the current application of Buddhist knowledge and power for good, let's say, now in modern cultures and in the West, seems to me to be historically quite similar, its fundamental dynamic, to what has gone on before. Although our modes of communication are much more rapid now, the basic dynamics are not actually that different, it seems to me. And part of the meaning of skillful means has included the ability to draw on Buddhist resources that have skillfully addressed many pressing social needs of people in Asian cultures. And this is how the application, for example, of the 6 perfections, or in Tibet and other Vajrayana cultures, the 4 kinds of tantric activity, how they actually took shape in relation to specific needs of diverse Asian communities. In other words, these were not merely abstractions, nor were they merely ways for the individual to attain enlightenment. They meant embodied expression, meeting deep needs within cultures in very specific ways. To express the compassion at the heart of Buddhism in Asia and Tibet has meant to draw on Buddhist resources, ritual, meditative, philosophical, and other resources, to meet people's deep felt needs for protection and healing and extending life, and for help in dying and beneficial rebirth, to avert epidemics and floods, famines and pestilence and poverty, to promote harmony in society and in the cosmos, to promote prosperity and good fortune and success, to protect from malevolent spirits and harmful animals and thieves, to provide ethical systems for social stability and well-being, to provide beneficial new forms of learning in language and literature and poetry and song and philosophy and medicine and the arts and new technologies. This is the wealth of Buddhism. This is the application of skillful means in diverse Asian cultures, each profoundly enculturated specifically into each unique culture, meeting its own uniquely felt needs. As Buddhist teachers and communities learned throughout Asia new ways to apply Buddhist philosophy and ritual and meditative power to meet such needs in cultural settings, they were thereby also learning to participate beneficially in all strata of society and culture. Such learning functioned as a tutorial in skillful means. That part of what skillful means has meant implicitly is a kind of a tutorial or learning about many or all dimensions of a new culture by engaging every part of it. So as to concretely give Buddhist compassion and wisdom effective new forms of cultural expression. Many people in Asian societies first took interest in Buddhism for its perceived power to meet their deep felt needs. And that interest in turn supported increasing interest in the sources of such beneficial cultural power, which encouraged further social and economic support for Buddhist monastic universities and meditation traditions that preserve systematic paths of enlightenment, together with the full range of application of enlightened power for societies. You follow? So, in continuity with that process, Buddhist resources are now being applied in fresh ways, and Tibetan Buddhist resources also, newly applied to help address deep felt needs and problems of modern societies. And Tibetan Buddhism is making an increasing contribution. Tibetan Buddhist thought is being newly applied to inform current problems in social ethics, economic justice, poverty, inequality, issues of war and peace, ecology, education, social welfare, and interreligious dialogue. Tibetan meditation theory and practice contributes to new kinds of learning in the social, cognitive, and natural sciences. Social workers, hospice counselors, teachers, chaplains, healthcare givers, psychotherapists, and others are being trained in Tibetan meditations of tranquil abiding and compassion and wisdom, in part to help them become more fully present in their work with the physically and mentally ill, the dying, prisoners, addicts, trauma survivors, Alzheimer's patients, learning disabled students, and more. Human rights workers, environmental activists, educators, and social change agents receive contemplative trainings adapted from Tibet to help avert burnout and compassion fatigue and to discover a place of greater unconditionality in their work for social change or social justice. Tibetan Buddhist organizations have launched new initiatives in Nepal and India and Tibet and elsewhere in health education and vocational training and care for orphans and street children and the elderly, schools and medical clinics, and disaster assistance. In short, by applying its resources to help address modern social needs and problems, Tibetan Buddhism today, as in the past in Asia, continues to develop enculturated, skillful means that embody its deepest values of compassion and wisdom. And in doing so, as in the past, Tibetan traditions draw a widening cultural interest in all of their institutions of learning and practice, which are viewed as the sources of fuller training from which further applications for society can come. The speakers on this panel and many of those who are participating in this conference are on the front lines of these new applications in the present time. So welcome to everybody. And we'll begin with with Jan Willis as our first speaker. Jan is the professor of religion at Wesleyan University and has studied with Tibetan Buddhists in India, Nepal, and Switzerland and the US for over 4 decades and taught courses in Buddhism for 37 years. And Jan is the author of The Diamond Light, On Knowing Reality, Enlightened Beings, and the editor of Feminine Ground. And she authored the really fantastic memoir, which I have to recommend to everybody, called Dreaming Me, An African American Woman's Spiritual Journey. In December of 2000, Time magazine named Jan one of 6 spiritual innovators for the new millennium. And in 2003, she was a recipient of Wesleyan University's Prize for Excellence in Teaching. And Newsweek magazine's Spirituality in America issue included a profile of Jan, and Ebony magazine named her one of its most influential African Americans. Welcome, Jan. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Jen. And thank you all for being here. I, too, am looking forward to hearing about the individual projects that people here are engaged in. I take it that I am to do a little more holistic, a little more integrative piece this morning. Some people make an argument that engaged Buddhism is something altogether different from Buddhism. It's a modern phenomenon, it's 21st century phenomenon, it's a Western phenomenon. It is the wedding of activism with Buddhist tenets. My own opinion is that from the moment Siddhartha Gautama stood up as the Buddha from his kusha seat, grass seat, Buddhism was engaged. It was engaged. He was on his way to spread the insights that he had in order to help beings escape their suffering. So Buddhism has been engaged since its inception. When the Buddha passed away in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, it said that he declared after 45 years of teaching that he'd only taught 2 things in those 45 years, 2 things, suffering and suffering cessation. When I asked my students to try to get at the core of Buddhism, that root that His Holiness was talking about. What's the root? Tibetan Buddhism is one tradition amongst many, many traditions of Buddhism. But there's a point where Buddhisms meet. There's a core. So I ask my students to try to remember some of these cores, and I point them to certain scriptures. For example, Dhammapada, verse 5. There it said, hatred is never appeased by hatred. Hatred is only appeased by love. This is an eternal law. And the term that's translated eternal law is dharma, in this case the Buddha's dharma. That's Buddhism in a nutshell. At Dhammapada 183, we find the statement, do no harm, practice virtue, purify the mind. This is the Buddha's teachings, all the Buddha's teachings. And of course we know about the succinct formulation of Four Noble Truths. There is suffering, there's a cause of suffering, there is the cessation of suffering, there is a path leading to the cessation of suffering, at which point I always go, yippee. There's a path leading to, excuse me. In my opinion, there are these startlingly clear presentations of both Buddhist doctrine and Buddhist practice in those little succinct formulations. And these remind me of other startlingly simple and clear formulations of doctrine and of practice. For example, at Matthew 22, verses 34 through 40, we find the following narrative. I'm trying to suggest love is not only the core for Buddhist religion, but it's also the core in other religious traditions, and I'll go on to say more about why. But at Matthew 22, 34, 40, we find these verses. But when the Pharisees had heard that he'd put the Sadducees to silence, they were gathered together. Then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him, saying, Master, which is the greatest commandment? And Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind. And this is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. So, succinct formulation. What is the heart of Christianity? To love God. That's the chief doctrine. And how does one show that one is doing that in practice? By loving one's neighbor. Some of you may know that I call myself a Baptist Buddhist, if you didn't know by now. And that's because I was fortunate enough to, as a teenager in 1963, to have been in Birmingham, Alabama, that's where I lived, to have marched with Dr. Martin Luther King. So, what I want to say is that some of the teachings that I find so moving and so powerful in Buddhism, I had already heard about from Dr. King. And it's about engagement, and it's about peace, and it's about love, and it's about how one fulfills one's responsibility to others. So marching with Dr. King taught us these things, that only through nonviolence can any triumph come, because when there are winners and losers, there's no winners, ultimately. We have to strive together, because in truth, that's the only way we can free ourselves. And though King, everyone knows that King was influenced by Gandhi, King also read Buddhism. He read Buddhism at Boston University, and he was also powerfully moved by the Buddha's example. Many times, Dr. King spoke of interdependence, and this is a phenomenon, we translate shunyata in these negative terminologies, emptiness, voidness, but really, if we could get past this feeling of isolation, or David Loy calls it lack, there's shunyata. One of the more positive ways of thinking about it is just to say we're interrelated. We're not independent beings, we're dependent beings, and we're connected, and that is the truth. That's the truth of things. We're interdependent. Martin Luther King spoke of this also. He said, all men are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are who you ought to be. And you can never be who you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. That is the truth of our being. That is the wisdom that must chart our trajectory as we attempt to help others. I remember in 1970, in a conversation with His Holiness Dalai Lama, I was concerned because Kent State had happened, and he said, after telling us that we had to develop patience so that we could develop clarity, the clarity to see how one could best act for others' benefit, he said, but then, after telling us that, and be calm and be clear and use a little wisdom and don't rush out there to do things unless you know what you're doing, he said, but you also don't have to wait. You don't have to wait for some perfect Buddhahood in the future. You do the best you can. You try to help with love in your heart. I was reading His Holiness's statement the other day, and I'm closing here. That's in his latest book, Toward a True Kinship of Faiths. He says that one of the most powerfully moving passages in Christianity, after talking a bit about Thomas Merton and his relationship with him, His Holiness says one of the most moving passages he's ever heard is the passage that's found at 1 Corinthians about love. 1 Corinthians 13, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, then I'm only as a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries, and I have all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but have not love, then I am nothing. And if I give all that I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing. And so we must, I think, try as best we can with love to feel our responsibility to others and to act on their behalf. With love, there are so many needful things. I'm stopping. Outside these walls, hunger and poverty are rampant in the U.S. as well as throughout the world. 1 out of 6 people, 1 out of 6, every night goes to bed hungry. Water, clean drinking water cannot be found. It's difficult. There is strife everywhere. Women the world over still struggle for equal rights. Nuns struggle especially for it, even within Buddhism. So during this panel and throughout the next few days, the next couple of days at least, I hope we can begin to discern, to develop, and to articulate how we can together begin to work together in an engaged way so that in a truly engaged way, Buddhist way, with love at its core. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Willis. So, I really think of Jan as, and part of the reason I recommend her book, Dreaming Me, very highly, is it's such an example in our own place and time of the kind of thing that had happened in Asia, where somebody becomes so deeply steeped in the Dharma as an enculturated human being, as someone who grew up in the South, as a Baptist, as an African American, as a human, with all the specifics of it, how that goes through the layers of one's being and comes out in ways that then speak into the culture and become the skillful needs of that place and time. Our next speaker is the Venerable Lama Pema Wangdak, who was sent to the West in 1982 by His Holiness Sakya Trizin as the first of the younger generation of Tibetan Sakya teachers in America. And in 1989, Lama Pema founded the Vikramashila Foundation, which encompasses the Palden Sakya centers in New York and New Jersey, Vermont, and Ohio. Lama Pema is the creator of Buddhig, which is Tibetan Braille. It's kind of a remarkable thing to create. And the founder of Pema Tsal schools in Mungot, India for Tibetan lay children, Pokhara, Nepal for monastic children, and the Pema Tsal school in New York City, which is modeled on Sakya College in India. The Pema Tsal school in New York City provides monastic training and study, but within also the format of a Western university kind of mode of teaching. Lama Pema was given the title Kempo by His Holiness Sakya Treason in 2007, and he received the Distinguished Ellis Island Medal of Honor Award in May 2009 for his humanitarian work around the world. It's an honor to have Lama Pema here. Thank you.
Good morning to everyone. I'd like to thank Dr. Willis for starting this tone of our panel discussion. And my strategy worked. I was supposed to speak first, and then her. I decided to speak first, so I'll get some her inspiration and set the tone. And I realized talking over breakfast table what she wants to say, and I realized it's a good thing to start. Mine is more specific, hers is more encompassing. So I thought it will fit one another. And also I realized the panelist has their own specific issues, so I think it will go very smoothly that way. So thank you, and I'm very honored to be here to participate for the second time, the International Tibetan Buddhist Conference, first in New York State. And this is the second one. I feel very honored to do this. As I said, I have no much to say in the sense of this is not a teaching, it's not a something, but I thought maybe share a little bit of my personal knowledge or observation, a little bit of experiments that I've done over the year along the line of social engagements. I thought maybe some of you might connect to what I have to say. A few scribbled notes. I have to remember which one to say first or later. Now, this is a Tibetan Buddhism, so I have to, like anything else, I have to think globally and then act locally kind of idea. So we have to focus on the Tibetan issue, meaning Tibetan Buddhism generally in the world, specifically Tibetan indigenous people, their way of life, because right now, at this junction in history, and I believe actually personally, Tibetan will endure as a people and nation and culture. But just in case, if they don't, we have to make sure that the Tibetan Buddhist culture survives in the world. So I want to talk more on the other side, the source, the spring, where everything that we're talking about in the world. In that sense, we must talk about Tibetan issues. I think Tibetan issues are pretty much international issues. We're really talking the same thing. And I did experiment with, first I decided to talk about how to uplift the inner poverty, not just food and clothes, because inner poverty is as bad as the lack of food and clothing and starvation and death and dying. In fact, inner poverty is more kind of, in a way, as a well thought of, intentionally made human source of all these human causes and troubles. Where external problems are almost instinctual. Hungry, we go and steal, that's okay. I will steal too if I'm hungry and starve. But the inner poverty is more deliberate and a purely human made, consciously thought about, designed, taught, and promoted. And we cannot do without, we cannot speak of external poverty without the inner poverty. And one of the ways I do thought was, let us use the richness of the human brain. In the case of Tibetan 50 years of exile, I just realized we lost so much brain power. I'm sure there are genius Tibetan young boys and girls who never got the opportunity. So as part of that, to make the long story short, I set up 2 experimental schools, one in South India, among these group of 7,000 Tibetan, chosen some 70, 80 children any given time of given education, the top kids whose brains were used as a way of investing our brain power to the nation, to the world. I think we need to sort of complement that, and Buddhism can do it. Because I think one of the Buddhist part of the contribution is power of wisdom. And then when it comes to action, I think non-Buddhists are a little better than the Buddhists. We have a lot to learn about it. So as part of that, I want to throw that, boys and girls, especially promoting the equality. Part of that is to make sure the girls get not just attention, equal, but a little bit extra helping hand attention. So we have a more majority of girls than the boys, just so that we have some uplifting, benefit. And also it serves the role model, so it gave the message to the community. And it literally gave a great degree of dignity and pride. And we have a 100% success. They all go to the college. And a bunch of them became even doctors. A lot more nurses, something normally we aspire for, but we can't quite show it. Other thing is a little bit more generic, and that is in a social thing, our monastic system is very strong from the beginning of the Buddha's life. The Buddha used the monasticism, I don't think as a separate from the world, but more as a model for the enlightened way of life, but then eventually became a separate part because the way it is set up. And I strongly feel in order for the teachings of the Buddha and his wisdom teachings to survive, it's not its strength, but it's up to us how far it goes. Buddha don't have power by then. We're the one, and we need to learn how to do. The one observation I noticed is how to seamlessly connect the responsibility of keeping the wisdom from the top monastic, ascetic yogics to all the way to ordinary people. I think one of the ways to do is make sure that we don't forget before we even practice the Dharma. And I think it's important two things: to learn, to teach everyone to say refuge prayers. Literally, start our activity with the refuge prayers. Combine that with the bodhicitta and conclude with some sort of dedication prayers. I think that kind of habit we need it in the West. We do have it among the Tibetans, but around the world we need that kind of a culturing. Great part of our spiritual matters are kept not with the fullest understanding, but by simple acts, simple impressions. So we cannot underestimate the simple acts. In fact, most of the people learn through inspiration and impression more than conviction. I'm a Buddhist not because I searched the world and came to the conclusion, but because I was born Buddhist. And I noticed that the great part of sending the message is purely impression, of friendliness. I saw that quality in Quran and in Bible and in Mahabharata and Ramayana. There's one thing that ties them together, and that is the beauty and the elegance and something it touches. And Buddhism can do it, which I think we need a little push to do that. Which means we need to incorporate the importance of the art, music. Certainly now the idea of incorporating science is very easy, and Isan has been doing it. And, oh, by the way, before I forget, as part of the refuge, we need to introduce the Sojong practice, fasting for 8 periods, which is called Mahayana Sojong. That is easily doable, especially it's very, very, very inspiring for the West where we have weight issues. We don't have to convince. If the teachers and leaders just simply push a little bit, nudge a little bit, they love to do it. In fact, I have students say, you tell me, we'll do it. And it's good if we do it. I propose to do on the special holidays, 4th day of the first lunar month of the year to 15 for 12 days. First 3 days we need to celebrate Losar. 15 days of Vaishak, first 15 days of Vaishak, And every full moon, new moon, and 8th day doesn't mean everyone has to do it, but these are the reminder to do it. On the Buddhas coming from the heaven, we call Haptijan, who could do that too, and the Dharma Chakra day, who can do that too. So we need to have this kind of a culture kind of embedded in our hearts and the hearts and minds of our next generation. It could help. I know there's no such absolute solution. If there is none, absolute, any solution is good enough. And it can make a huge difference, both health, spiritual matters, and a lot of things. Also, talking about environment, I did a little bit of experiment, planting some mango tree in the school site in South India, Mangot, and worked 15 trees maybe. And now we're thinking about maybe recently some of the Lama talks about it. It's on Sakya Tizan. My teacher, the head of the Sakya school, emphasized all of a sudden very strongly in Europe and now in Nepal. So I was very feel obligated to listen to my teacher when they say it again and again. So we're going to, our children and teacher at school in South India will initiate this planting of 1,000 trees in Mangot. And then this will be a catalyst for our vision to plant at least 1 million trees. And that sounds a big kind of ambitious, but I don't think it's anything big deal. You just do it. And it's not that hard, impossible a project to do it. Anybody, if you have a house, plant 1 tree in front of your door. That kind of idea. And this should come kind of connect with the Sojong practice. Taking less, putting more. Is that right? Taking away some of what is excess and putting more where it's a little deprived. So I thought it was a good idea to promote that, and I am experimenting that. In terms of peace and in the world, etc., I think there's more importance to the approaches, how more than what it is. Everybody know what peace is, including animals. We don't have to talk again and again. But how is important, beginning with the Buddha's message. Throughout India, King Ashoka, India has produced 2-3 sons. The world knows, Buddha, Ashoka, Gandhi. But one of the things what is distinguished is how they do it. How they do it. If Gandhi were here, I'm sure he will do it totally differently. So there's no way he will do the same thing as he did during the British Raj. Things like that. So I like to incorporate a very creative thing. Every time we come up with a problem, come up with a creative thinking. And that is hard, but it takes a lot of brain power. But there's always a way we can accomplish that. How are we doing with the time?
3 minutes.
Okay. And the part of the earlier I said about the spiritual matters, I think we are more, our spirituality as beginner is defined more by our environment than our conviction. So I think as a Buddhist, economy seems to be the defining matters generally in the world, and especially for Buddhists. Buddha even knew about it. He taught the act of generosity as part of complementing, bringing some kind of better prosperity. So it's just to live and survive. So for that, I think right now the great part I'd like to introduce is this, how to bring economy back to where you come from, local economy. Now it's becoming like American economy with the Chinese power of, taking away a lot of, and that can lead to some kind of economic and social and even political unrest and unhappiness. So I always strongly believe that bringing back, keeping at least a degree economy as a safeguard in where you are, I think is very important because that defines your belief system. Recently, Sangha Lama was told by a Tibetan woman, the story a long time, she converted to Christianity because missionaries came and gave her everything, and she told his son, I got everything from missionaries, so I wanted to be Christian. But next level will be Buddhist, by the way. And something like that, most of us, we do that. I think she didn't miss anything. But when it comes to preserving the teachings of the Buddha, we lost a member. So we have a responsibility. It's not just we are Buddhists. Buddhists should be responsible for the preservation of the Buddhism, just as other members of the community should be responsible. So in that speech, I should take a break here, and thank you so much. And a lot to say, but short time, but it's more important to hear more from others. Thanks.
And thank you, Lama Pema. And it's also really remarkable to hear a voice coming from such depth, kind of digging deep from the depth of the tradition, and speaking also right into our place and time in ways that could be so helpful for non-Buddhist cultures and also for Buddhists in Western culture, for how our work to meet human needs stays in touch with its root and remains authentic and deeply based. Our next, the next four speakers are our panelists, and our time is very short for each of them, which is, I know, really terrible because they're like remarkable, tremendous contributors. But we only have about 4 or 5 minutes each for them to just make a few brief remarks, their own thoughts about Tibetan Buddhism and social engagement, and then that'll preserve some time so we can open it up to the floor for people to be able to ask questions and make comments and come into discussion with the whole panel and speakers. Our next speaker will be Tsoknyi Rinpoche, who was recognized by His Holiness the 16th Gyalwa Karmapa as the reincarnation of the second Drubang Tsoknyi Rinpoche. Rinpoche is a renowned master of Drukpa Kagyu and Nyingma traditions, and since 1991, Rinpoche has been teaching students worldwide in the Dzogchen tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, and his unique and remarkable approach is reflected in his books Carefree Dignity and Fearless Simplicity, which are just amazing books. His teachers include Kamto Rinpoche, Dogo Khyentse Rinpoche, his father Toko Orgen Rinpoche, Nosho Ken Rinpoche, and Adju Rinpoche. Yeshe Rang Sel in Creston, Colorado, is Tsoknyi Rinpoche's seat in the West. So thank you so much for coming, Rinpoche.
Thank you. I'd like to speak 2 principles of Buddhism automatically engage social issues. Number 1 is non-violence. Number 2 is containment. So the non-violence is ingrained in the genes of every Tibetan. I think biologists might not agree with that. So I change bones of every Tibetan. And this is the basis of non-violent community and peaceful society. For example, in Tibet, even the 2-3 years old children, when they saw bug in their house, they carefully pick it up and take outside and release nicely. So I think this shows some natural effect in the society which practice nonviolence. And the second principle is contentment. The Buddha taught the middle way of lifestyle to his disciple. Take what you need. And today's world, too many people think that they can buy happiness with unnecessary consumptions. I think this is very harmful and danger to our environment. So if you say take what you need, how do you know? I usually say, ask your body, not your mind. Body will tell you what you need. Mind will tell you all the rubbish things. Body does not know what kind of brain are you wearing. Body needs just warm and smooth. Doesn't matter whether you're wearing Nike or carrying polo bag. So body is more honest than mind. If you follow the mind might think, oh, the basis is 5 houses I have to have. One house that I need to consume all the material goods, so I have to have a house in the town that I produce money that I can buy one weekend house after 45 minutes away from my town. Then you go there and then, oh, I need a longer vacation. I think I need a nice house in the mountain that I can have a beautiful breathe, that I can relax. After some time, then you thought, oh, this is very dry, boring. I need a moist place, so I have to buy one house in beach area. And as a Buddhist practitioner, then you think, oh, I need one house in the Himalayan. Without that, I cannot practice. By preparing all of this, I think the time of the last breath might happen. So I think this is the 2 areas of, if you can practice nonviolence and containment of the right livelihood, I think that can help the whole humanity in ease, and especially the Mother Earth can be rest. Thank you.
So our next speaker is the Venerable Karma Lekshe Tsomo. And Karma Lekshe Tsomo is an associate professor of theology and religious studies at the University of San Diego, where she teaches Buddhism and world religions and comparative religious ethics. And she studied Buddhism in Dharamsala, India for 15 years and received a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Hawaii. When I met her in Dharamsala many years ago, she was busy at work making peanut butter to sell to help support the monasteries and learning centers there. She is a founder. She roped me right in to help her make peanut butter. It was amazing. She's a founder and past president of Sakyadhita, International Association of Buddhist Women, and director of Jamyang Foundation, which is an innovative education project for women in developing countries. Karma Lekshe Tsomo is the author of Into the Jaws of Yama, Lord of Death, Buddhism, Bioethics, and Death, and is the editor of Buddhist Women and Social Justice. It's a great honor to have the Venerable Karma Lekshe Tsomo here. Thank you for coming.
Aloha and tashidele. Very happy to be here today. Starting out, I would affirm what all of our speakers have said, that the practice of Buddhism, especially the practice of the Mahayana tradition, entails social engagement. Loving kindness demands social engagement. And especially the practice of the bodhicitta. If we take this commitment seriously, and it's an enormous commitment to liberate all sentient beings, infinite sentient beings of all the 3 times from suffering, then we have some work to do. I've just been on sabbatical and visited 14 countries in 14 months. And I saw many heartwarming developments. In north of Kathmandu, I saw a monastery with 800 nuns, all healthy, happy, practicing day and night. At Yarchen Monastery in Kham, I saw 8,000 nuns with no clean water, inadequate food, no medical care, practicing day and night in little wooden boxes. And then farther afield in Sri Lanka, I found almost 1,000 bhikkhunis, fully ordained nuns, something that was unthinkable even 20 years ago. So these are amazing developments in the history of Buddhism. At the same time, I saw many heartbreaking things. Spending 3 months in Bangladesh and seeing the tragic situation of the Buddhists along the Burmese border. Spending 3 months in Nepal and seeing people starving. 200,000 starving people who have now identified as Maoists because they're hungry. They have no hope. All the foreign aid is going into a few pockets in Kathmandu. The people are hungry. So I would like to acknowledge, first of all, the amazing, wonderful work that American Buddhists have done in social engagement, from being on the front lines of the anti-nuclear movement, for example, being on the front lines of the hospice movement, being on the front lines of the prison dharma movement. Many wonderful, wonderful things have been done in this country. Now, some people say this is because we were raised Christians and Jews. We've already been inculcated with serving the poor and working for social justice. And I say, so be it. That's a wonderful confluence of traditions. That's a strength. There are a few things that I noticed that I'd like to just throw out there for discussion, for reflection. First of all is education, the need for literacy. Many Buddhists are completely uneducated. There's millions and millions of Buddhists that are still illiterate. In addition, there is an issue of religious literacy. Many Buddhists do not have teachers. Even though the Buddhist tradition has the most wonderful system of education, many Buddhists in traditionally Tibetan Buddhist areas have no access to it. This is a huge need. These wonderful systematic Buddhist study programs need to be expanded and made available, especially to women and children. The second issue is global warming, the environmental effects of our lifestyle that are reaching the Himalayan regions, causing drought for year after year after year. No rain means no snow, means no water for irrigation, means less food, driving men to the cities to earn a living, to support their families. This is causing huge social dislocation and misery. We have to take responsibility. Third, big issue, big elephant in the room, conversion. Because of the dire economic situation and the global warming resources and the lack of religious literacy, Buddhists are prime targets for conversion by Hindus, by Muslims, by Christians. I saw this in all the countries that I visited, something that we're not aware of here, perhaps, in North America. It's a very serious issue. They say that if Buddhists don't get started, if we don't start working harder, Mongolia will be Christian within 20 years. Some provinces are already Christian. I have a feeling here from a Korean Protestant dentist. In Mongolia, the theme song is Christians give, Buddhists take. Tragic. So we have a lot of work to do. This brings up the issue of social services. Why do people convert? They get free English lessons, they get free jobs, they get free education, free English lessons, so many advantages, social programs, dances for the youth. So if we want Buddhism to continue in these traditionally Buddhist areas, we're not talking about converting people who are not Buddhists, but of preserving Buddhism in traditionally Buddhist areas. The next point, and perhaps the most appalling of all, is sex trafficking. Sex trafficking of young children as young as 6 years old from Buddhist areas, disproportionately. They say that the population of Nepal is 30% Buddhist, but 70% of the women and children trafficked are Buddhist. In Cambodia, it's a raging social disease. But where are the Buddhists? Who's helping? And last, I'd like to, of course, I guess that's why I'm here, raise the gender issue. The issue of the gender imbalance, which, like all imbalances, is the root of problems, many problems. There's tremendous domestic violence still in traditionally Buddhist areas. There's a need for conflict resolution training and gender awareness training in Tibetan Buddhist areas. And I must say, most especially in Buddhist institutions. Buddhist institutions are completely imbalanced. Women have no voice, no representation in most Tibetan Buddhist institutions. So we have to address these structural inequalities. Again, we must take responsibility. I hope that all of you will continue to raise this question: where are the women? Where are the lady lamas, right? So now they have monasteries, they have food. Where are the education programs? So now Sakadita was created in 1987 as an international association of Buddhist women to link Buddhist women and supporters from around the world. We've organized 11 conferences. The next one, the 12th one, will be in Thailand next summer. We warmly welcome all of you to attend. We're bringing the issue of Buddhist women to the United Nations. We found that Buddhist women have literally no representation at all at the United Nations, and there are tremendous resources to be had by going to the United Nations. So we are registering branches of Sakadita in various countries around the world in order to bring representation for these. Well, I've been saying 300 million Buddhist women, but actually I just went to China and they said, no. There are 300 million Buddhist women in China alone. So you have to double your figures. Okay. So I hope that all of you will help us and work together to address. I'm sorry to stir the soup and raise some uncomfortable issues, but I trust that all of us have a strong enough commitment to the Dharma and to social justice that if we work together, we can really bring about some important changes. Thank you so much.
Our next speaker is Acharya Fleet Maull, who is a senior teacher in the Shambhala Buddhist lineage. And he is the founder, basically he's a giant in one of the really foundational figures in creating a new vehicle for applying Buddhist practice and modes of presence and personal presence to help the lives of prisoners. He's the founder of the Prison Dharma Network, Peacemaker Institute, National Prison Hospice Association, and the Naropa University Center for Contemplative End-of-Life Care. He leads meditation retreats, bearing witness, and street retreats, chaplaincy trainings, prison trainings, and peacemaker trainings throughout the world. Fleet is also the author of a remarkable book called Dharma in Hell, The Prison Writings of Fleet Maull. Fleet, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, and very honored to be here with.
Can you hear me? Is it on?
Yeah.
Very honored to be here with Tsoknyi Rinpoche and all the panelists and speakers and guests. I'm not going to speak specifically about my own work. I want to make more general remarks about our subject, Tibetan Buddhism and social engagement. His Holiness this morning suggested that we allow others to sing our praises and that we should engage in self-reflection and looking at our own limitations and faults. So in that light, I know that we're all deep lovers and appreciators of this profound Tibetan tradition that we share. But having said that, I may speak to some of the challenges that we face. And I want to say also that, that my experience is primarily here in America, in the US, and in the West. So I have that bias. Although Professor Makransky began by speaking of all the myriad ways in which Tibetan Buddhism is showing up in beneficial ways to the world, and that's certainly happening all over the world and in this country. And at the same time, I would say that our tradition has been, especially here in the West, yet largely involved in personal liberation. And understandably so. I mean, we all know it's a very daunting path to deal with our own suffering, to try to follow our own path, to try to accomplish these practices and to develop ourselves spiritually. It's a very daunting task. Even among the types of Buddhism active in the US, I wouldn't say the Tibetan Buddhists that we've been in the lead in socially engaged Buddhism. I was just at a socially engaged Buddhist symposium last month, and there was a paucity of Tibetan Buddhist representation there. Much stronger representation from the Zen traditions and the Theravada and Vipassana traditions. So I think we have our work cut out for us. Of course, as Professor Willis said, all Buddhism is engaged. Thich Nhat Hanh has said all Buddhism is engaged. But I prefer the term socially engaged Buddhism. And even there, I think it's certainly important for as Tibetan Buddhists to be involved in every aspect of society, from political dimension to business to the world of academia and so forth. And my own root teacher, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, emphasized bringing enlightened society to all these levels of human endeavor. And at the same time, I wish to focus more on what many people think of when they think of socially engaged Buddhism, which is those people who are falling through the cracks and who are on the margins and suffering under poverty and oppression and racism and violence in our world. Professor Willis emphasized love, and for those of us who were at the meetings yesterday on compassion meditation, we heard that we have a natural capacity for empathy and for love and compassion as human beings. And yet, for there to be active compassion, for us to be willing to actually do something, to respond to something, we seem to need to see there's a possibility of an actual end to something, there's something we could do that would actually reduce someone's suffering. I think many of us, in terms of personal liberation, are focused on this rather exalted goal of the ultimate cessation of our suffering, reasonably so. And sometimes we look out in the world of so much suffering and we think, well, what can I do? Well, I think we have to look more closely at what we can do. And as His Holiness said this morning, we need to go back into the roots of our tradition. So I think if we look even at our precept tradition, and we look even at the lay precepts of refraining from killing, and we look instead at how do we protect life? Where are we not protecting life? You know, where were we as a Western community in Rwanda, where I'm now doing work? Where are we in the Congo right now? Where are we in protecting women and children from violence all over this world? If we look at refraining from stealing, and instead we look at that as issues of economic justice. You know, where are we in terms of addressing the issues of economic justice? If we look at the precept around refraining from sexual misconduct, again, where are we in protecting the children and the women from exploitation in this world? So even just that, if we reframe the precepts in a positive construct, like Thich Nhat Hanh has done, and look, what does it call us to do instead of just what it calls us to refrain from? It gives us a great framework for a much more socially engaged Tibetan Buddhism. In the Mahayana tradition, of course, we have the Bodhisattva tradition, which is all about engagement. But again, I think it's very easy for us to still translate the Bodhisattva ideals into our own path of personal and individual liberation. My own teacher presented the Shambhala tradition as a warrior Bodhisattva tradition, very much emphasizing that it's about acting. It's, of course, not acting from wisdom, and we have to cultivate that wisdom, but it's about acting. It's about being in the world and being engaged. Our Vajrayana trend, you know, part of, I think, the great news about our Vajrayana path is it's obviously this profound, accelerated path to liberation. And yet, at the same time, it's so demanding that it may prevent many of us from having the time to get that socially engaged. But I think where I see the great benefit in that is that these practices are some of the most profound practices for creating more resilience coming into the body, as Tsoknyi Rinpoche said, and creating resilience and capacity to serve, to actually having the capacity to go into the charnel grounds without losing our seat, without losing our wisdom, to working with the winds, with the prananadi and bindu, to develop profound capacity and resilience to go sit in those fires and to sit alongside people who are suffering in the charnel grounds that exist in our cities and rural areas in this country and exist in places all over the world, and actually have the capacity to show up there and serve from a place of wisdom. So I do think our tradition has profound things to offer to the world of social engagement, and yet I think we really have to sort of wake up to that call and realize that somehow we have to pursue our own spiritual evolution while at the same time serving in this world because the world needs us. Thank you.
Thank you, Fleet. And our last speaker is Diana Kaythorpe Rose, who is the president of the Garrison Institute, a nonprofit organization. I mean, I think probably everybody in the room knows Garrison Institute very well now. It's just emerged as a leader, really, in engaged application of Buddhist knowledge and practice. It's a nonprofit organization whose mission is to apply the transformative power of contemplation to today's pressing social and environmental concerns. and to build a more compassionate, resilient future. Diana's career reflects her commitment to creating linkages between individual transformation and social transformation, much of what other panelists have also touched on, and also between spirituality and social action. Diana has served on the boards of several national Buddhist organizations in America and is president of the Lowstand Foundation, a private charitable organization that she and her husband founded in 1997 that supports social action, land conservation, and sustainable development. Mrs. Rose was educated at UC Berkeley and has a professional background in art, design, event production, and gallery management. So welcome, Diana. Thank you for presenting.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be in this company and humbled to be sitting in front of you to talk about what we've been doing at the Institute. But I wanted to start with just here. Is that sound good? Okay. Is that better?
Yep.
Okay, good. That really I'm sitting here because of my teacher, Gelek Rinpoche, who has encouraged most of his students to take the teachings and find ways to bring it back out into the world and work with it in our everyday work that we do. When the opportunity to start the Garrison Institute, we were offered this remarkable monastery. Is that better? Am I not? No. I'm speaking it better. And we were. Is that better? Okay. I'm sorry. We were offered this remarkable opportunity to take over an old monastery outside of New York, and I seek counsel with Gelek Rinpoche and His Holiness, and we were asked, you know, what can we do with this that will be of benefit? And the message that came back was that it needed to be open to all lineages, based in the Dharma, invite great teachers to come and teach, and to also find the ways to bring it back into society in really engaged ways. So we're doing that, I think, quite effectively at this point. I'm going to start with a little quote here from Dan Siegel, and that is, we are in desperate need of new ways of being in ourselves and in our schools and in our society and with our environment and nature. We live in a troubled world with individuals suffering from alienation trauma, schools failing to inspire and to connect with students, and we desperately need to help clarify how we move forward in our global community. So with that, I think Tibetan Buddhism and Buddhism in general has a huge amount to contribute in terms of the quality of our state of mind, because from our state of mind are the decisions that we make. And from the decisions that we make, the quality of decisions we make, our actions flow. And if we can infuse in a secular way, the state of mind that people are in, that are in leadership positions and in serving positions and are working in schools and are working in shelters and in prisons, and if we can infuse a better state of mind, a mind that is filled with compassion and kindness, that is open and receptive and present, and that their decisions follow that, then the actions will naturally change and behavior changes. And then whole systems can change. So the work that we're doing at the Institute has focused in 4 areas. One of them, to invite great teachers from all over, many traditions, to hold retreats and teach. And then there are 3 other areas that we've dedicated ourselves to. One is education, K through 12. We've been doing a lot of work in that for the last 6-7 years. We have pilot programs in schools we've done them in Denver, we've done them in many other places. We right now have a government grant from the federal government, a large grant to do research and development on a teacher training program called CARE. And again, it's working with teachers who are in inner city public schools and rural schools who need support to do the kind of work they do. It's giving them skillful means. It's teaching them awareness and resiliency in education. It's helping them to be mindful and more compassionate as they come into the classroom, to be models for their students. We also host a whole series of conferences and forums of other educators who are interested in contemplation and education. We've held 2-3 forums a year now for 5 years of experts in education who are really leading the way in piloting programs. Another area that I'm quite passionate about is working with trauma. And it's a program I started with Sharon Salzberg here. I went to her one day and I said, you know, there's a lot of people working on the front lines of trauma, and as Lorianne Perlman wrote about it 10, 15 years ago, vicarious trauma is rampant amongst people who work with traumatized populations. It is a huge issue. It's an issue that people don't pay attention to. And vicarious trauma, for those of you who don't know what it is that people who bear witness and care for people who are traumatized begin to absorb the trauma of the people they're working with. And they don't even recognize it, and it's almost too late. And then burnout happens, their own mental stability is in jeopardy, and a lot of other things happen. So Sharon and I put our heads together and we said, yes, this may be something where Buddhism and the practices of love and compassion meditation could really help and help people sustain themselves. Out of that grew a group of clinical psychologists who are who are practitioners, who understand the connection between loving-kindness meditation and mindfulness meditation and the work with trauma. And we created a pilot program working in inner-city domestic violence shelters. And we work with frontline workers. And we're not teaching them Buddhism. We're very clear about that. What we're giving them is a secular version that they can work with, whether they're Christian or Muslim or atheist. And we went into inner-city domestic violence shelters, predominantly minorities. Frontline workers are often survivors themselves. That's why they're motivated to be there. But they're given no training whatsoever. We worked 5 years. We developed a pilot program, trained over 400 frontline workers, and worked in over 40 shelters. As a result, the directors of the shelters saw such a change in what was happening that they asked for the same program. We did that for a while, and then the biggest shelters came to us and said, okay, we get it. Now we want your training throughout the entire shelter from top to bottom. And what began to happen was a change in culture. The compassion for one another, the support that they gave each other, the creation of quiet rooms so that they could sit and meditate in between sessions, and it grew and it grew. We're now about to launch an international program for international humanitarian aid workers, a similar training program. I got 1 minute. And then the last area that we've been dedicated to since we opened is the environment and environmental leadership. And there we recognize, again, it's the state of mind that you bring to the problem and to the policies. If we can shift people's state of mind, their relationship to the environment, then the kind of economic decisions they make and the kind of behavior that they exert towards the environment will also shift. And we started a program called Climate, Mind, and Behavior. I know I got 1 minute left. Climate, Mind, and Behavior, which brought together a hugely diverse. It brought economists, it brought behavioral scientists, it brought neuroeconomists, policy people, environmental people. They meditated. You know, we asked them to slow down and meditate, loving compassion meditation, and then begin the dialogue. And the whole thing shifted and opened up. And a recognition of personal responsibility starts with what's in your mind. So I wanted to close with something by the Buddha. I wanted to just say that this is a quote that I got from one of Sharon's books, actually. The thought manifests as the word manifests as the deed develops into habit, and the habit hardens into character. And so watch the thought and the ways with care, and let it spring from love, born out of concern for all beings. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. We have enough time left that we can have the opportunity to really welcome whoever would like to raise a question or a comment that could be directed to any members of the panel.
But I wanted to tell you thank you for being here. I knew I would get the support I needed. I'm from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I felt like I came to hear Dr. Willis right away speak about religion. I wanted to give you an example, give you some feedback about what's happening in the middle of the country, in the Bible Belt. About a year ago, a young woman from Oral Roberts University approached me to discuss Buddhism, to find out more. She knew I taught, she knew I led a group, she knew I had been in Tulsa for 10 years, she knew I was on the boards, interfaith and working, and we interviewed for a long time. And afterwards, I asked her, I said, you know, tell me again why you would like all this information. She was very attentive. And looking straight at me, she said, because we are in India and we are in all those countries, and I would like to know more about Buddhism so we can convert Buddhists and bring them to Jesus. And I was so stunned. I said, thank you. There was nothing else to do. In case you don't know, Oral Roberts is a huge corporation, religious corporation. It's very, very big. There's a phenomena that's occurring now. People have read so many Buddhist books in America, and especially where I live, everyone thinks that they know what Buddhism is. And this is a good thing. It's bringing a lot of peacefulness, but it's also bringing many misconceptions about it. So it's very important that a group like ours holds the place. And because I've had very good teachers, I have not grown big, but I've remained very accurate. And this has been, it's the accuracy that has created the confidence in Buddhism. It's not the buildings and getting bigger and bigger. It's the accuracy, because people see that. And the last thing I want to give you a perspective on is that we are now having a big emergence of hatred against Muslims. So my role now is becoming more political. I never thought this would happen. Even the Interfaith Board is no longer permitting interfaith dialogue as such because it's too contentious. But something good is coming out of it. There's a willingness to love alike. We cannot believe alike, but we can love alike. And so this kind of language is starting to try to pull back the conservative Christians who have now left because people like me are becoming more visible in the community. But the Buddhist voice gives a compelling language to compassion and love that was not there before, and it's really helping.
Thank you, thank you very
Willis,
much.
I wanted to thank you for your
And also, part of your message reminds us that there's a business meeting tomorrow at 11 a.m. that's linked to each panel. Some of the elements of what you just said, thank you for that, seem to me relevant for something like a business meeting. Suggestions about important principles involved in how Buddhism goes forward in its social engagement in Tibetan Buddhism. So feel free to come to that business meeting and to give input. And then our next speaker. Oh, sorry, Jen, yeah.
Just a brief comment. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. A couple of short stories. Buddhism generally has had an inordinate impact on this culture. I mean, when you see jumbotrons at Times Square with His Holiness's face and the caption, "Think Different." I mean, Buddhism has made a big smash here, far outshining its really meager numbers for the impact that it's had. So that's pretty clear. A couple of things that His Holiness talked about forgiveness. Martin Luther King talked about love and developing it, nurturing it, cultivating it. Takes bhavana. I think we've been hearing that the last couple of days, that this kind of practice, that love and loving kindness has to become an attitude. It has to become ingrained. It has to become automatic in us. But that takes training. That takes training. That takes overtime. Two other things. I'm sorry, it will be short. A young black woman came to one of the people of color Buddhism retreats I was on, and she felt really badly. I ended up being her mentor. She came for office hours, sort of, and she said, "You know, I'm having trouble with this because I feel like I'm deserting my Baptist tradition, and that's so strong, you know, I feel." And she said, "But the more I've been here, the more I'm coming to see that, you know, you're supposed to be able to develop a time and a space where you can hear that still small voice." And she says, "I think now that I can match prayer and meditation, because to me now I understand, after 5 days of meditating there with us, I understand that prayer is asking God for something, and meditation is helping us to hear His answer." And I thought, perfect, you got it. You got it. Martin Luther King said, "I don't have to like Him, but I do have to love Him. If I call myself a child of God, I don't have to like Him, but I have to love you because God loves you." Thank you.
Yes.
Wow. My name is Andy Cantor. I'm a physician, actually, from Columbia University in New York City. And I work with Jeffrey Sachs and the Earth Institute in the Millennium Villages Project. And I'm also, for about 25 years, have been working with Physicians for Social Responsibility, trying to save the world from nuclear weapons and from the environmental degradation and so on. And I'm just very humbled to be with such people as you and with so much learning. But I actually have, I guess, two questions, and maybe to follow up a little bit on what was brought up in by a couple of people. One, we are in a crisis now, and I know there have been many crises through time, but we're also in another crisis that might potentially eliminate all life on this planet. And it seems that Buddhism has a possibility for eliciting certain, I think as His Holiness mentioned, secular ethics that could serve as sort of underlying principles to bring us together to really address these problems and get past many of the, as he mentioned, where the branches diverge and bring us back toward something we can all agree, both Christians, Jews, and Buddhists, and hopefully Islam as well. And so I wondered if we could explore a little bit more how this tradition might provide us these underlying principles that could inform, for me personally, it would be Physicians for Social Responsibility and Healthcare Without Harm and Physicians for Human Rights and the Millennium Villages Project and the work we do for global development, but do it in a context that is mutually supportive and mutually reinforcing, because right now the forces of darkness are also mutually enforcing in the wrong direction. And then the second thing I'm wondering is it possible to use that experience for those people on the front line to come back to some core group of Buddhists who are charged at taking those use cases, that experience, and feeding it back into the practice, to inform the practice, to make it a traditional, to make it a new teaching that is directly grounded in the experience that we're having. And I think in America we have a unique opportunity through our privilege and also perhaps through our just global experience and so on, that we're willing to go out and solve, or at least attempt to solve, these big problems. But how does that then come back and inform the teachings in such a way that it can be passed on to the next generation of people at the front line to prevent the burnout, but also to really positively reinforce a transformation of this planet that we're looking for? And I'd be really interested in what those next steps might be for people who are both inside and outside of this spiritual community.
Who would like to respond?
I'd just like to add a question to that real briefly, just around this issue of really bringing a lot of the skillful means of our tradition out in secular ways. And we've been hearing a lot about that. And in the prison work that I do, I think the majority of Buddhist teachers going into prisons are presenting their work in a very secular way. I think one of the challenges there is breadth and depth. As Professor Willis said, we've made a big splash here in the West in many ways, given our numbers. And so we're being called to show up with all these wonderful, skillful means and create benefit. And the way to do it most quickly is to secularize it, because then you don't have the issue of religious acceptance. And at the same time, how do we do that? Get that breadth while still maintaining the depth and working to create the depth so that we really preserve a true wisdom tradition out of which that will come. I just wanted to raise that question in addition to yours.
I'm going to get this mic right now. I'd like to comment on that. We do introduce it in very secular ways when we're working with, like, real estate developers who need to change the way they're building buildings so that they're green. That's an industry that you would never think Buddhism would infiltrate, but in fact, we've had major corporations, heads of major corporations come, do retreats at the Garrison Institute, and get very deeply touched by it. What I find happens is you begin that way, and then if it really touches somebody deeply, they come back for more. And that's when they seek out a teacher and then go to a retreat and begin to practice. But I don't think you start with if we had started with our real estate group, teaching them hardcore Dharma traditionally, they wouldn't be in the room. But we've given them ways to shift their mind, their mindset, and open up and recognize things that they hadn't recognized before. And by opening that door for them, then those that seek it can find ways to get to teachers. And I think that that's a service.
I affirm the principles of seeking universal values that have been expressed. And also I'd like to speak to your last question. I agree with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, that we need to bridge the Buddhist traditions rather than creating more factions, more varieties, more flavors of Buddhism to suit our own sort of, interests and needs, but to work together more. He says sectarianism is poison, and I've seen that in my own experience. So I would suggest that we all try to break through some of these boundaries, some of these allegiances, which sometimes can be an extension of ego, and try to create bridges among our traditions and work together instead of creating more nonprofit organizations. There's something like 80,000 denominations of Christianity in this country. I don't think Buddhists need to replicate that. If that's of any help. Thank you.
And then I'd like to also just say another word to another element of your question, which is very important. And I think it also, again, when you raise the question of how does the learning from socially engaged Buddhism out there come back into some here, so that we're learning from it in a way that affects how we understand the resources of our tradition and the way that we can continue to articulate them better and better, offer more and more in more effective ways. That question, I think, relates to institution. And I think there are some institutions that are very much engaged in that. That statement was a description, in fact, of what is very much beginning to go on. I think Naropa University is a key part of this, that they are an institution that basically is dedicated to that kind of project. And so they are a holding space where people are being trained to go out there in all kinds of programs, and then chaplaincy and service and prison work in many areas. And then they come back, and that's the container in which they can learn from that experience, have discussion. It's also an academic institution. It's like perfect for this kind of thing. In the Boston area, inspired by those kinds of models, there are two new organizations that were formed partly to do this very thing. One is called Natural Dharma Fellowship, and the guiding spirit of that and the director of it is Lama Willa Miller, and she's here in this room as well. And that part of the mission of that is very much to explore engaged practice as part of Ngundro even, Tibetan Ngundro, including engaged practice in a way that comes back in, becomes discussion, we learn from it, and so forth. And another one is called the Foundation for Active Compassion that I helped to establish also in the Boston area, which is primarily dedicated to this very thing. So it is happening, and those are only examples. There are many others. Dr. Germano, did you have a question or a comment?
Yes, my name is David Germano from the University of Virginia, and I just had 3 kinds of points of concerns or topics to offer, and I talk quickly, so don't worry. My own obsession is about Tibet. Tibet as a place, as a series of local communities that still live across the Tibetan plateau. And I worry that often when we talk about social responsibility in Tibetan Buddhism, we forget that kind of relationship back to these people and these places and these local communities, because it's such a complex kind of issue, such a complex set of challenges and difficult challenges. So my 3 points, or my 3 topics I wanted to throw out there is, first of all, that in Tibet itself, there's a conflicting set of visions of the responsibility of Tibetan Buddhists to social responsibility. And we see this in monasteries in Tibet that have taken very different stances towards the social responsibility of monasteries. Many continue to reiterate the old traditional paradigms, and yet we also see new monasteries across the plateau, like Jigme Jensen in Golok, or Dorji Tashi in Lagong, or Tsultrim Lodra in Serta, who have taken very proactive, very different senses of monasteries' social responsibilities, who have been at the forefront of creating kind of secular education, Tibetan immersion education, such as Dorji Tashi, or looking at new revenue streams like Jigme Jensen and trying to stream this towards the education, again, of kids and especially of women, or Tsultrim Lodra, who's a radical vegetarian and who has many different social missions across the Tibetan plateau. So one thing I wanted to throw out there is kind of point to that tension. Tibetan Buddhists don't agree in Tibet itself, and they're taking very different stances towards this issue. The second one is our own kind of sense, my sense of our own obligation to these Tibetans, to the place in Tibet where most Tibetans continue to live, especially for those of us who live in North America and talk about Tibetan Buddhism and social responsibility. And there's these tremendous boundaries of inequity that separate us from people in Tibet, and they face tremendously complex problems that demand complex forms of understanding and complex commitments that extend over many years and immense difficulty. And so I think one of the challenges we face as people involved in Tibetan Buddhism is to begin to rethink our own individual and our institutional configurations, our obligations, our actions in this regards. And I think as you pointed out, there's like 2 needs that Tibetan communities have. One is issues of governance, issues of kind of legal, education, healthcare, transportation, security, and so forth. But the other one is the kind of profundity of local forms of being, local forms of knowledge, which Tibetans also care about. Otherwise, just with healthcare and education, they lack what has made them distinctive communities over many hundreds of years. And so in that regards, my last kind of point and my last question then is, here we are at a university, and many of us are involved in education or universities, whether in monastic or nonprofit or kind of higher education and so forth. And so a question I ask myself, which I think we all have to ask ourselves, is, are we ethical in terms of the institutions we live in or the individuals that are part of those institutions? And when I ask myself that question about universities in North America and universities in Europe and universities in Asia, I would say the answer is absolutely not. We are not ethical institutions. We speak an ethical language, but our actions and our behavior and our systems of involvement are not ethical, and especially with regards to Tibet. And so in that context, when I look at these 2 issues of the kind of needs for different kinds of governance, health, education, and so forth, and ways that Tibetans need support for local forms of being, their own kind of local forms of knowledge, I think on the other one hand, with regards to us as universities, we don't work with the nonprofit sector. The nonprofit sector and higher education have very distinct kind of bodies of knowledge, very distinct commitments, and yet when I look at the Tibetan plateau, I do not see fruitful partnerships for the most part in this kind of area, involving the professional schools, linking them to people who actually know about Tibetan Buddhism, Tibetan studies, towards more fruitful partnerships. And secondly, in terms of this issue of local forms of being, we, in the kind of educational system, we don't have a kind of system of knowledge, its production, its dissemination, its refinement, and so forth, that involves local communities and local forms of knowledge. And so I think we have to shift towards thinking about how do we as universities and other agents involved with education offer a system by which local Tibetans can engage in acts of self-representation, access various forms of knowledge, and then we might be able to answer that question, at least in our little local area, that yes, we are ethical. So that's my 3 points.
Thank you. I'm so happy that we caught that on film, and we're virtually out of time. But is there any quick response that anybody wants to give, or we can also leave that for pondering? Okay.